Hey humans, hello. Like to see those of you out there. I'm glad to see some numbers, some people tuning in. I'm glad you're out there. Go ahead and drop some comments into wherever you're watching just to say hi. We are getting ready to fire it up, and we're going to be talking about AI ethics and all of the whatnot around that. So please start getting your questions ready and your comments, and I'll introduce you to our guest in just a moment. I am, of course, your host, Kate O'Neill. Every week, it's just me. So let me hear from those of you who are online. Say hi, tell me where you're joining in from. We're already covering a pretty big chunk of the globe between me and our guests, so I hope we're covering even more of the globe with some of our watchers and listeners. Today, we're going to talk about AI ethics, get those questions warmed up. And this, as you may know, is a multimedia format program, as I like to call it. It means that as I'm speaking, it's being broadcast live, but it'll live on as an archive on all the channels where you can find it now. So that's YouTube and Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Twitch, even though nobody watches us on Twitch. They might start to after AOC was just live on Twitch last night, so that's really getting the channel going for us. Thanks, AOC. So it'll live on as an archive on all those channels, and then of course, so those of you who find it later are seeing this as an archive. So hello to those of you in the future from those of us in the past. We appreciate you. Also, each episode gets turned into a podcast the following week. So today's episode will be available as an audio podcast next Friday, and tomorrow, last Thursdays, will be available. So keep up with the podcast that way if you prefer audio. And every week we explore different facets of how data and technology shape the human experience. So I hope you'll subscribe or follow along wherever you're watching or listening to this. Don't miss any new episodes because they're wonderful. Oh, please do note that as a live show, we'll do our best to vet comments and questions in real time. We're going to take those and try to make them live into our interactive format, but we may not get to all of them. So we very much appreciate you being here, chatting with us, and just generally participating in the show. So now to introduce our guest. Today we are chatting with Abhishek Gupta, who is the founder of Montreal AI Ethics Institute and a machine learning engineer at Microsoft, where he serves on the CSE Responsible AI Board. He is representing Canada for the International Visitor Leaders Program, administered by the U.S. State Department as an expert on the future of work. He additionally serves on the AI Advisory Board for Dawson College and is an associate member of the LF AI Foundation at the Linux sorry, that was a lot of acronyms. Sorry, LF AI Foundation at the Linux Foundation. We got it. Abhishek is also a global shaper with the World Economic Forum and a member of the Banff Forum. He is a faculty associate at the Frankfurt Big Data Lab at the Goethe University, an AI ethics mentor for Acorn Aspirations, and an AI ethics expert at Ethical Intelligence Company. He is the responsible AI lead for the Data Advisory Council at the Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities. He's a guest lecturer at the McGill University School of Continuing Studies for the Data Science in Business Decisions course on the special topic of AI ethics. He's a subject matter expert in AI ethics for the Certified Ethical Emerging Technologies group at CertNexus, and also a course creator and instructor for the Coursera Certified Ethical Emerging Technologist courses. So if you want to take those, you can take them. His research focuses on applied technical and policy methods to address ethical, safety, and inclusivity concerns in using AI in different domains, many of which we'll discuss today. He's built the largest community-driven public consultation group on AI ethics in the world that has made significant contributions to the Montreal Declaration for Responsible AI, the G7 AI Summit, AHRC, and WEF Responsible Innovation Framework. I'm going to have to ask for help on, is this PIPEDA amendments for AI impacts? He'll have to help me with that one. Scotland's National AI Strategy and European Commission Trustworthy AI Guidelines. I mean, this is quite a bio, right? His work on public confidence building and AI ethics has been recognized by governments from North America, Europe, Asia, and Oceania. And we'll give you more information on how to find more about his work toward the end of the show. But gosh, if you're not bowled over and falling out of your seat from how amazing those credentials are, I hope you'll help me welcome our amazing guest, Abhishek Gupta. So Abhishek, you are live on the Tech Humanist Show. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thank you for having me. Nice
Yeah.
to see everybody here.
Yeah, and as I mentioned when I was warming up, that we're already covering a lot of the globe. You are joining us from India today, right?
Yeah, yeah, joining everybody from India. We've been
Late.
experiencing some heavy rains,
Oh, okay.
and yeah,
It's
so yeah, getting to enjoy a little bit of that. It's a little past midnight here,
oh
so
my
if I
gosh.
seem a little bit loopy, I hope you'll give me a little bit of rope there.
Loopy is sort of the theme of the show, so I don't think we're gonna have any problem there. But yeah, it's amazing that you're joining us so late. I would be not competent at midnight. But well, it's so cool. Man, what a background. Oh yeah, correct me on the pronunciation on that PIPEDA. Is it just pipida or how do you say it?
Yeah, yeah, it's PIPEDA, so it's
Pipida.
Canada's privacy legislation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Great. Excellent. Yeah, well, you're involved in everything. You have a hand in all of it. That's amazing. How
Well,
did you
I also have a stellar team behind me, so that definitely makes life a little easier.
That's fantastic. How did you get going in this field? What got you started?
It was an interesting journey. So I was at the first AI for Good Global Summit in Geneva in 2017 at the United Nations, and it was interesting. Of course, this was 1 year before the start of the, or before the, sort of coming into effect of the GDPR, and discussions in Europe were much further ahead, I have to say, compared to North America and the
Mm.
rest of the world when it came to thinking about the ethics of technology. And of course, GDPR is specifically focused on privacy. And I found it fascinating that in Canada, where we really pride ourselves on being inclusive, being concerned with some of the societal impacts of technology, we weren't really paying as much attention as we should have to this topic and area. And the other thing that I realized was that even the places where these conversations were taking place, a lot of these were sort of behind closed doors. They were limited in terms of who was able to participate in those discussions. And I think that was one of the things that really stirred me towards the work that I started to do, which was to invite people from different parts of the community, from different walks of life, to really come in and participate in these discussions. Because I think we all have something to offer. We all have different experiences and a lot of the challenges that we're now facing have surfaced in one form or another in different fields. And that was something that was missing, where there was this sort of, not to, maybe, for the lack of a better phrase, there was a degree of elitism in terms of who was able to participate and where these discussions were taking place. And that's sort of how I got started, was to really create an arena for people to feel welcome, to feel appreciated in terms of what they had to offer, and at the same time be a conduit for providing a little bit more nuance to the conversation, rather than trying to make blanket statements saying that robots are going to come and take my job.
Yeah. I like using that phrase within my work too, just because it seems like it's the pinnacle of what people's anxieties about. Well, no, no, no. The pinnacle is I hope we don't become servants to robots. Like that's sort of the worst case scenario that people are always anxious about. But well, and then I love that you made sure that you were doing the work of inclusivity, as it's mentioned in your bio that that is one of your focus areas. But a lot of people talk about broadening the reach and bringing in more of the community, but it's really important work to do that and actually get more stakeholders and more constituencies at the table. So
A
yeah.
100%, yeah. And a lot of this actually, well, while we were still allowed to meet in person,
Hmm.
this was something that we prided ourselves on, was to be able to invite people to different venues from all these walks of life, to come together and to have this time together to discuss these issues, where we were able to facilitate a sort of common ground when it came to different levels of understanding, but different backgrounds and experiences as well. Because again, as you said, uh, when it comes to inclusivity shows up in different forms. It can be in the form of tokenism,
Mm.
where you just throw something on there to appear to be inclusive, but to really be inclusive is hard work.
Yeah.
And listeners will of course appreciate that as they listen to your show. They already probably realize that, and a lot of people doing great work in this space. But when it comes to being really inclusive, that's hard work. It requires persistence, perseverance, and that's something that we've kept as something that's integral to our work from the very beginning. And I think over time that's paid off in terms of the community that we've managed to build.
So I think one of the ways in which your work seems like it's inclusive is that you're not just focused on Montreal, despite the name of the organization, right? You seem as if your scope is actually broader than Montreal. It's Canada, it's North America, it's really the whole world. You're really playing in a very global kind of international arena. So how does your work entail keeping up with AI ethics developments, or how much does it entail keeping up with developments around the world as opposed to just those that are within the scope of Montreal, say, or Canada or North America?
Yeah, no, and so that's a great point, and one of the reasons for why we have Montreal in our name was, well, because it's my home, and that's where we started. But certainly we now have a very global scope. We do keep up with most developments, not all, because, well, it's just impossible with the pace of change. Um, and the reason for doing that is also each different part sort of brings a facet or a nuance that gets missed elsewhere.
Mm.
And I think one of the things that we've noticed recently, which a colleague of mine and I highlighted in a recent MIT Tech Review article, was how a lot of the AI ethics work is sort of Western and Northern European and North American focused, both in terms of the impacts of technology, the kind of platforms that it analyzes, but also the sort of ethical philosophies that it looks at. And there is a tremendous amount to be gained from looking at perspectives from other parts of the world.
Hmm.
And some of the challenges in other parts of the world are also quite specific to those places. And that's something that doesn't get talked about often. One of the things that we see, which I think is particularly problematic, is lumping everything together in the global south. I mean, the global south isn't a homogeneous whole. It is rich with diversity, each with its own specific context, its culture, their own sets of values, and what people aspire to and hold near and dear. And that, again, I think we need to draw a bit more focus towards that. And through our sort of global analysis and keeping in touch with the developments from different parts of the world, we're able to bring in some of those perspectives into these conversations, which is something I think that tends to get reflected in our work when we're talking about this breaking out of that, as you said, the North American mold,
Hmm.
which is dominant, yes, but there are other parts of the world as well.
What are some of the developments that you see happening in other countries or other parts of the world that you think maybe North American ethicists and stakeholders should have their eyes on and should be paying attention to?
So one of the developments that I think one of the developments, or rather one of the perspectives, let's say, that I think doesn't get enough attention is the way robots, and I'm talking about not robots as in Terminators, but like simple embodiments.
Uh-huh.
But let's say we're talking about social care robots, and the perspective that say the Japanese have versus the perspective that you have in the United States, and how there are differences in terms of how robots are portrayed from a cultural perspective, and subsequently how the societal perceptions are shaped, and how willing and accepting people are of robots in a social care setting, which is radically different in a place like Japan versus in the United States. Uh, Other perspectives that are interesting to think about, for example, is the Ubuntu philosophy when it comes to thinking about the place of a human being, and how it is something that's relational rather than rational. And there is a lot to be learned if we were to reimagine or let's say imagine technology ethics from these ethical philosophies rather than just thinking about it from utilitarianism or from deontology or virtue ethics or any of these sort of, let's say, more well-known ethical philosophies. So there are all these different perspectives that you would see from different parts of the world that get sort of missed in that conversation.
Yeah, that I know John C. Havens was talking about that too when he was on the show, and I love that idea of bringing that Ubuntu philosophy into the fold and making sure that we're having this, very integrative, holistic discussion about all of the
Mhm.
different viewpoints. What
Yeah.
in general, are you seeing movements towards certain kinds of regulations in other parts of the world that you think are going to be meaningful in the way they influence? Like, say, the GDPR, for example, has been hugely influential. As you mentioned, it's privacy focused, but of course, it has repercussions for AI and for other parts of technology. Are you seeing anything like that anywhere else on the horizon that you think like, oh, this could really play out in some interesting ways for AI?
Hmm. So I think, one of the places where I've seen, or let me rephrase. I think what's interesting when we're looking at some of these legislations like the GDPR is that I think it sets a great standard, right? There are no two ways about it. But it's given that it was the first endeavor that was sort of wide ranging and sweeping. I think it's held up as the gold standard, even though it does have sort of chinks in the armor where things do slip through the cracks and there are ways that we can improve it. On the other hand, I feel that some of the legislations like the BEPA in the state of Illinois, the CCPA, these are interesting in the fact that they're quite targeted in terms of either sort of domain scope or in terms of regional scope, and the there are pros and cons to this approach, right? The pros being that given that it's more targeted, uh, the potential for being more fine-grained in terms of
Hmm.
the measures that you can put through, the controls that you can ask for, and subsequently the impact that you can have is just so much. It's just so much better compared to having something that's very abstract and high level. And of course, legal scholars will challenge me that the beauty of having something that's high level and abstract is that it allows you for flexibility when it comes to encountering uncertainty or different scenarios that you didn't envision in the beginning. But
I'm a big fan of both
it also
and though, so I feel like that's where this really applies in this case.
absolutely, and exactly here, what happens then is that there there is potential for different interpretations of these regulations of these laws, which leads to inconsistency in application. And I think that's part of the problem in terms of the frustration that people face when they, let's say, face injustice because of an algorithmic system. Is depending on where you are, you might receive different outcomes in terms of the process of recourse, the sort of judicial process that you have at your disposal, just because of the way different bodies choose to interpret those laws. And again, I think that's it's not a knock on the legislative or the legal system. It's just that maybe there is room there for being a bit more fine grained in terms of the recommendations that we make. And ultimately, I think making them a bit more actionable so that there there is, yes, room for interpretation, but there isn't so much room for interpretation that you're twisting it to your own needs. So basically following it in letter but not in spirit.
Yeah, it makes sense, and I think about that a lot with things like, as you mentioned, the Illinois biometrics law and things like that. That they are, at least within the context of U.S. law, it seems to happen a lot that you get, states or even cities that try out different kinds of legislation, and then you can sort of see how it plays in a small scale before it's ever really entertained at the federal level. And I don't know how often that model is, plays out in other countries and other parts of the world that, you get that sort of almost like test ground for different markets to see how these things play in small scale before they can, really be entertained at the federal level. But that
Yeah,
seems like there's a lot of value to that, to having, as you say, at that federal level, you definitely want to have these nuanced but abstract but applicable kind of those kinds of conversations. But it seems like, at least from my perspective, it must be a lot easier once you have some demonstrable kind of results that are from smaller sort of test markets in a sense.
yeah, no, and I like that you use the word, test ground or sandbox really. And I think when we keep mentioning how policy making and lawmaking, always trails behind technology, just because of the slower cycle for it and whatever other checks and balances that we have in place. Rightly so, because we
Hmm.
don't want to rush things. At the same time, sometimes it feels like we're trying to legislate cars when we still have horses. Or sorry, we're trying to
Other
legislate
way.
horses when we have
Right.
cars on the road. Yeah,
Right.
and what's problematic there is it's because of that slow cycle, right? If we have these smaller sandboxes and test grounds, then we could really attempt to experiment and experiment in a positive sense, not experiment as in trying to see if there are some negative harms that we can get away with, but really to see how we can create the most positive impact, how we can be the most actionable that we can, and to do that at a local level, to involve at that local level the community itself in gaining that feedback, because gathering feedback at a federal level is incredibly hard to even assimilate all of that and to feed that back into the process. Whereas if you did it at a municipal level, now that's something that's interesting,
Mhm.
because you do have some of those processes in place to be able to manage and assimilate and act on the feedback that you could gather from the local communities.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Now, you were talking too about, the interpretability of regulations, and of course, I know that your focus is on AI ethics, not AI regulations, but of course they go a little hand in hand. So I'm wondering, in terms of interpretability, what are some of the concepts that AI ethics initiatives, for the most part, seem to agree upon? Because I know that there are a lot of different ways that AI ethics initiatives kind of approach the scope and the layout of how they're going to define what standards are, and how they're going to be measured, and how they're going to roll out and involve the community and things like that. So what are some of the things that you see as the things that are generally agreed upon, or that you think should be the things that are agreed upon in the sense?
Well, and I mean, that's a it's an easy and a hard question. It's an easy
Hmm.
question in the sense that I think at this point we've had so many sets of guidelines and principles that I one would imagine that every possible principle out there has been covered, many times over.
Hmm.
That it's fairly easy to draw up a list of things that are commonly accepted. We can talk about fairness, privacy, security, accountability, transparency. But I think one of the other issues, that's the flip side of this coin, is that the taxonomy of this entire sort of space is also muddied quite a bit in the way people use these terms. So
Hmm.
everybody means slightly different things when they're talking about even something like privacy, which one would imagine has fairly well settled upon definitions for what
Right.
privacy should be. But when you're talking to people coming from different walks of life, and even if they're from the same walk of life, but coming from different regions or
Hmm.
jurisdictions, the way they think about privacy is different. The nuances are where things are interesting, right? Because ultimately when it comes to implementing this stuff, the devil is in the details, right?
Hmm.
And without that, um, we're really just patting ourselves on the back with all of these high level principles, but not really coming to grips with some of the more concrete ideas around, well, when we're talking about privacy, if if you make a claim about the privacy of a product that you're building, and I make a claim about the privacy of the product that I'm building, a third person as a consumer, how are they to judge whether Abhishek or Kate's product is better in terms of privacy protections? Like, how do we evaluate that? Because we might be coming from different definitions of what we think it guarantees the privacy of the data of the consumer. But your protections, the protections that you're offering might be stronger than the ones that I'm offering. But the consumer has no way of knowing about it, and neither do we have any standardized benchmarks that help us evaluate that, right? And the reason for that is because we don't have a shared taxonomy, and every new set of guidelines or principles that come out, yeah, they all come up with their own new definitions of what privacy should mean, but not just privacy. That's just one dimension, right?
Mm.
What is fairness? What is accountability? What is transparency? And then interpretability, explainability, intelligibility. All of these, sort of slightly adjacent areas, but each of them means something slightly, different. Lots to talk about there, but again, I think we need to all agree, at least for the most part, on some of the core aspects of these definitions, so that we can start to move past just posturing when it comes to taxonomy, and really start to move towards implementing those in practice.
Yeah, and then first of all, I guess one question is, have you seen anyone do a sort of super matrix of all of these different taxonomies and definitions and try to map one to the other? Like, is there some body that is tracking, privacy as it's defined over here versus over here, transparency as it's defined over here as opposed to over here? Have you seen anything like that?
So there are several initiatives, right? And again, I'll preface all of my comments by saying that it's a laudable effort to even embark on doing that work, because it's a thankless job. Um, that said, initiatives like I believe there's one from the Berkman Klein Center that has this sort of very nice, sort of visualization. It's like a mandala, and has sort of all the principles and everything mapped out, and which sort of sets of principles talk about which definitions and all of that stuff, right? The problem with these initiatives is that they quickly go out of date. Well, why? Because these are typically research projects that are funded for a specific period of time. So you have a sprint of effort that goes into creating them, working on them, and then it just sort of all goes static,
Sure.
right? Because there is more stuff that comes out, and then if I was to even go back and look at that visualization, that's already, I don't know how many months old it is at this point, but it's definitely more than 6 months old, right? And there have been developments in the past 6 months that
Of course.
would warrant inclusion in that,
Hmm.
and would perhaps alter the landscape of that taxonomy. But of course, no one's maintaining that actively anymore. And there are other initiatives, right? And that's the problem with these, is that it's necessarily something that evolves all the time, and it's just so hard to keep up. So either we need folks to stop making amendments to the taxonomy, which, I think when there is significant changes proposed, I think it warrants putting out something new, but just, publishing a new paper at yet another conference that reframes the definition of what intelligibility means, just because, and adds just a little bit, something different there. I think
Sure.
it just muddies the water, and confuses the whole, discussion, and takes away valuable effort from where we could now be moving towards actually putting it into practice, rather than, again, just theorizing and posturing around it.
Well, so it sounds like I was going to ask you what, in your view, have been some important concepts that maybe some or most of these initiatives have overlooked. And one of them, it sounds like maybe sort of standardization in a sense, like kind of coming to agreement on what even the terms mean or the taxonomy is or whatever. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that, and also I think even within these principles, there is an overemphasis on some areas, right? And that's bound to be the case. When more people start entering into the domain, which is great, and learning about it and engaging with some of the history of the work that's been done by the scholars in the space. One of the problems with that, though, is that you can end up focusing far too much on a few areas to the exclusion of others. An example of that would be how machine learning security is something that is an area that's overlooked. Now, machine learning security, when we're talking about that as an area, I think is quite fundamental in terms of the impact that it will have on all the other tenets within AI ethics. And the reason I say that is because it is it so when we're talking about machine learning, it basically opens up these new attack surfaces that fall outside of traditional cybersecurity measures, meaning that we're now able to attack machine learning systems in novel ways that aren't covered by the traditional cybersecurity protections that we put in place, which means that if you, in all earnestness, put um, bias mitigation measures in place as you were developing an ML system, if I was to compromise the model uh, through an attack like data poisoning,
Hmm.
um, I could sort of negate the effect of that bias mitigation measure that you had put in place in the beginning, and hence basically render useless the efforts that you put in, and create this situation where I'm slowly able to compromise all of these different facets of the ethical considerations that you put in place for that system. And it continues to baffle me that despite a lot more work being done in this space, machine learning security barely ever gets a mention in popular media or even in other research circles that are outside of that ML security domain, where most of the effort still seems to be focused on issues like privacy, fairness, bias, interpretability, explainability, and those are, yes, those are very, very important areas. But I think we also need to not um, sort of not ignore some of these other areas which are important to consider, especially when machine learning security is sort of like this foundational cross-cutting piece where if you ignore it, you're sort of diffusing the efficacy of the efforts in all of these other areas where you're working so hard really to do right by everybody.
Well, it seems like it's a vulnerability that, might be easy to overlook if you're not someone who spends time with, execution and building and trying these things. And that's what I was going to say. It's actually an interesting segue because I was going to say you're in an interesting position as someone who's a software and machine learning practitioner, as well as someone who's, helping shape and lead the discussion on AI ethics. So this seems like one of the insights that you bring as a result of that. But what other kinds of insights do you think that being a practitioner affords you in this dual focus?
I think the biggest benefit that I get by being able to sort of straddle both worlds is to look at the places where we experience friction. And what I mean by that is when we're talking about principles, it's great when we're talking about them in the abstract, but at some point, some of it needs to be put into practice, either in the form of a technical intervention or an organizational change. And I'm not talking here about larger systemic changes because those are, of course, those require a great deal of momentum, and there are other scholars who are much better placed than I am to talk about how we might do so most effectively. But at least from a practitioner's perspective, this is the place where I see a lot of efforts and initiatives failing to gain traction or failing to make an impact, is because they fail to consider the needs of developers who are on the ground. And what I mean by that is, if you come and tell me, hey, we should build models that are unbiased, that really isn't actionable advice for me as a practitioner, because unbiased can mean a lot of different things, and unbiased also can be implemented in, well, one, unbiased is a fallacy. Like you can never get that, right? You can mitigate bias, you can never completely eliminate it. That said, there are many different ways to go about it. There are many different implications of that. But most importantly, where in my workflow should I start to think about that, right? And a lot of people talk about, well, you should do it in sort of all parts of your life cycle, or you should do it here, you should do it, towards, engage with designers, do this and that. But a lot of the times, that advice is sort of uh, not well received because, again, it's too amorphous. It's not specific enough to the point where if I'm an engineer working within a particular department, which is within a business unit, which is within an organization, you need to make sure that all of these recommendations that you're making align with those technical policies and practices of that department that you're a part of, and how do you orient that with the business goals of the business unit that you're a part of, and ultimately the values that the organization holds dear. And without doing all of that, it's very idealistic to say that yes, this will happen, because at some point uh, the people who are on the ground only have so much decision making power, and if you give them advice that requires uh, you know massive overhaul, that's something that's not going to gain as much traction, just because it's really hard for one person to make that change. And so I'd rather that we start by at least taking concrete steps in the right direction, and then creating local champions within the organization who understand the value of this and who then become advocates for this change, because that's how you start a movement. You don't come and say, hey, we're going to upend everything that you're doing, because then people are just going to ignore what you're saying and go about doing what they're doing, because at the end of the day, they're getting paid to build products and services, and if you ask them to abandon all of that, chances are your advice is not going to be well received.
So is that part of, is there an initiative within the Montreal AI Ethics Institute? Are you focusing on trying to sort of translate a lot of sort of guidelines or advice into what can be applied within organizations, or is that outside the scope of the organization?
No, no, and no, and that's exactly the kind of work that we focus on at the institute, is to look at what are the right points of intervention, and then to really work on the ground in terms of uh, how how painless can we make it, and apologies for using that term, but I think for the lack of a better phrase, really that is what we're looking to do, is to eliminate the pain, to make it easy to do the right thing. I think that's how I would think of it, is if you make it dead easy to do the right thing, people will do the right thing, or at least they'll have much more of an incentive to do the right thing. But if you make it incredibly hard, it's just easy for us as humans to not have to put in that extra effort to do the right thing. And so, to give you an example, when one of the projects that we're working on is to help developers assess the environmental impacts of the work that they do. And of course, both you and your listeners are no strangers to the massive computational requirements for running large AI systems. How do we make decisions in terms of when we should use large AI models, if there are better alternatives, if as consumers should we be picking particular manufacturers of these systems who are more green, and how do we make those comparisons? What do we do that? But all of that starts with somebody being able to quantify
Mhm.
the impact that they're having. And not to say that there aren't initiatives already, there are. The problem with a lot of these are they ignore the developer's workflow, in the sense that they ask you to go to an external website and input a bunch of numbers and parameters about how you build your model, where you train them. And let's be honest, as developers, we hate documentation. It's just true. What
Hey, I
that
got my
means
start
is that
doing developer documentation, so I can attest to that.
so you can attest to that, right? So you know better than anyone
Comments
then
and
that
code?
you know,
There's no such thing.
nobody likes. There's no such thing. So the problem then is if you're asking me to go to an external website and put in all of this information, chances are I might do it the first couple of times, but I start to drop the ball later on because it's just something that you wouldn't lend too much of a priority on. But if you were to integrate this uh, in a manner that's something similar to ML flow, which helps you sort of within the context of your code, capture hyperparameters, do experiments across, or sorry, do comparisons across the different experiment runs that you're doing. Now that's something that's a little bit more natural to the developer workflow, to the data science workflow. Now, if you were to integrate the environmental impacts in a manner that follows this precedent that's set by something like ML flow, there is uh, there is a lot higher of a possibility for people taking you up on that and subsequently reporting those outcomes back to you rather than me having to go to an external website, fill out a form, get the result, take that PDF report or whatever,
Right.
and now append that as a part of the rest of the product or service that I'm shipping. That's just too much effort, and I think that's so. Those are the kinds of things that we're working on is to inject uh, this sort of doing the right thing or thinking about ethics right into the developer workflow so that we, again, as I said, can take those incremental steps in the right direction. We don't ask you to come and completely throw out everything that you've been doing because we know that maybe you'll do it the first time, but then you'll go back into old habits and so that's really what we're trying to do is to make it easy for you to do the right thing.
It almost sounds like it's almost like a wrapper around the existing workflow or process anyway. And beyond, like you're right, of course, the barrier to participation, being removed means that you'll probably get more participation. But it also seems like, um, if we are interested in being champions of ethics and of good outcomes, then we have to think about the ways to be most effective in getting those those kinds of initiatives, deployed and followed and so on. So it is incumbent on us as advocates of these ideas to think in the ways that you're describing, to think about like how could I actually make this more effective? How could I make this more integrative into the workflow that's actually going to make it more likely that we're going to have compliance and more likely that we're going to have feedback that's useful and instructive, right?
Yeah,
Is
no,
that fair?
yeah, no, absolutely. And I like how you put it because I think it is incumbent upon us in the sense that ultimately, you know, you can have the greatest idea, but if you're unable to communicate it and the other person isn't able to receive your idea, then it isn't a great idea after all, right? I mean, or rather, I should say that you didn't do a great job of communicating that idea, and I think a lot of that is what plagues our domain today. Is a lot of the knowledge and the insights are trapped within these white papers, within these research papers that are written in dense academic jargon.
Hmm.
And again, you've worked in technical documentation in the past, so you'll appreciate this. Like, if you don't make things clear, no one's going to read it,
Right.
right? People just going to try a bunch of random things and hope that it works. And that's we don't yeah, and we don't want that. I mean, the number of memes that you'll find on Reddit where people just don't read the documentation because it's too hard and just try a bunch of things and hope that it works. That's sort of we don't want that to happen here, especially that we're dealing with real impacts on people's lives. And you know drawing out these insights from these dense academic papers and 600-page reports. There are some 600-page reports, would you believe it? uh,
Yes.
who's reading that stuff, right? It's folks like us who are deeply interested in the space, but for
Hmm.
the everyday developer who um, just wants to do the right thing but also still get on with their day job, they're not going to read the 600-page report. One,
Right.
because they don't have time, and two, maybe they don't even have the expertise to parse all the
Sure.
technical jargon that you've used there. So it really is, as you said, incumbent upon us to communicate this message in as clear a manner as we can.
And I want to pivot just a little to, with the time we have left, I wanted to ask you about, kind of thinking about ethics in application. So, are there applications of AI that you would argue can just not be ethical? So, for example, maybe military use of AI weapons. Are there any acceptable uses there that we should be thinking about, or should just whole categories of AI application be avoided from an ethical standpoint? Or there's also, of course, cities and regions enacting bans on facial recognition. So can the ethics there be resolved, and how will we know when we've resolved them?
Those are really, really hard
Yeah,
questions, and
not
I like
they're
to
not
save them for
simple.
the end. uh,
It's my favorite thing to do, to
while
ask
my
like a big, wide-reaching question when there's only a few minutes left on the clock.
when there's a few minutes left and all my brain power has been exhausted.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. But no, it's interesting in the sense that I think there isn't a clear black and white answer, and the reason I say that is because a lot of it does depend on the surrounding measures, as you pointed out, right? Like it depends on some of the regulations that surround how you use some of this technology, but also making sure that there is alignment with the context and the culture, the values that of where that system is being deployed. Yes, at the moment there are use cases where we should completely abandon the use of AI because we haven't figured out the problems just yet. There are too many things that can go wrong. The systems are too brittle. They're too vulnerable to being misused that we should just lay them dormant or abandon them, revisit them once we've figured some more things out. And that's that might be discouraging to some folks who spend a lot of their time figuring this stuff out. But that's just the nature of discovery and invention, really, where we might come up with great ideas, but sometimes we just don't have the potential to use them in the right manner, and hence we should just hold off on it till we figure out the right way to use them, or sometimes not use them at all, and that's totally fine. And I think that's one of the things where, as you pointed out, we sort of see this inevitable march towards more automation and more AI, where in some areas maybe that's not the case. Maybe we should stop and question and say, hey, maybe the good old ways are they're good.
Yeah.
Just because they're
Paper
old
and
doesn't mean
pen.
they're bad.
Right.
Paper and pen, hey, hey, think about this, right? Everybody said we were going to move to a paperless office, right? But that never happened, and we still use a ton of paper. So, I mean, that's, of course, that's a facetious example when it comes to what we're talking about. But I think, for the time being, when we're thinking about the military uses of
Mhm.
AI or when we're thinking about facial recognition technologies, I think just the outsized potential in terms of how this can be misused,
Mhm.
it doesn't warrant us from using it when we have other alternatives that work and still sort of get the job done. In terms of, let's say we want to do identification, is it necessary that we use facial recognition technology? I mean, right up until now we had been using other forms of identification and
Mhm.
they worked despite having flaws. So if we know that facial recognition has all of these problems and can be misused, maybe and a lot of companies, of course, are holding off on using it. And now there are, emerging regulations in different parts that, prevent its use. I think you're right in saying that, in some places we should just not use it at all.
Well, and that's why I guess, sort of the follow-up thought there is it even really useful to talk about AI ethics, quote unquote, as a whole discipline, or is there such a fundamental difference between talking about the ethics of something like GPT-3 versus something like intelligent autonomous weapons that it makes sense to discuss, ethics of subdisciplines or subcategories of AI or specific applications of AI or contexts where it's being applied?
So I, for one, am more of a proponent of tailoring things down to different domains because I think and different domains, and I mean, use cases is being too specific, but at least different domains, because some of the challenges that are presented differ quite a bit, where for us to say, hey, let's apply explainability wholesale across all of these domains, keeping in mind these principles, sometimes can fall flat. And which is why I think in a lot of places we aren't seeing as much traction with some of these principles being implemented in practices, because if you want to cover a large area, you necessarily have to be broad. But by being broad, you're, again, making them not actionable. And I think that's one of the problems that I see, where perhaps, starting having have those overarching principles, but never forget that we need to be domain specific as well. We need to be jurisdiction specific as well. Because again, if you're proposing something that is orthogonal to the legal frameworks within a jurisdiction, that is never going to fly either, because people are going to side with complying first with the legal requirements that
Hmm.
are mandated for them, than to try and do something that is, for the most part, self-regulation or just, prescribed industry standards. So again, I think, when it comes to thinking about this, I would say thinking about the ethics of AI in specific contexts to me makes more sense than to talk about ethics of AI, because again, AI itself is such a broad term, and there's so many different ways of how it gets implemented in practice, that we really need to be a bit more granular in how we approach it.
So then I also want to give you a chance to be an optimist at the end of this discussion, thinking about all the different applications of AI and all the different way, the huge space that AI covers. What are you most optimistic about when it comes to? I would usually just ask my guest when it comes to technology or the future of human experiences, but I'd love to hear specifically in your mind an application of AI that makes you feel optimistic and hopeful about what it could do for humanity.
So one of the things that I think is fascinating, and we've been making sort of so many strides in this space, is machine translation. And the reason I'm so fascinated by it is because it has the potential to unlock participation from people from different parts of the world. A lot of the knowledge today still is locked in different parts of the world, just because we aren't able to effectively communicate with each other, or it requires a ton of translation effort. And again, the people who are effectively able to, sort of straddle two different or three or four different languages, there's so few of those people, right? And even those who are, to be able to truthfully translate between one language to another without losing the
Right.
meaning and nuances is hard, right? There are very few people who can do that very effectively. And so a lot of knowledge and the richness of our, culture and history is locked away, is inaccessible. And if we were able to do that in an automated fashion, I think that has the potential to unlock all of those pieces of knowledge. And then on my point around participation, when you look at the dominant language for the internet, it's English, of course. A lot of the research findings and everything is published in English. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who aren't making contributions in different languages. It's just that again we don't get to see them, but also that they sometimes face barriers in being able to consume this knowledge because it's only present in English.
Mhm.
I wonder what the potential for making progress, even if we were to just talk about, let's say preprints on archive, if they were to automatically be translated and be available in 100 different languages, imagine the kind of strides and progress that we could make, because there would be all these people, all these budding researchers who, maybe English is not their first language, maybe they're not comfortable with it, but because it's now translated into, French, or maybe it's translated into Hindi,
Mhm.
are now able to read it and understand it and say, hey, oh, this idea clicks for me, relates to some work that I'm doing. Why not build on top of this work?
Yeah, yeah, you really speak to my heart with that one as a linguist by education and a total human knowledge geek. It's really exciting to think about what you're describing there. So, last question is with our just our 2 minutes to go. How can people find and follow you and your work online and connect with what you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm active on all social media platforms. Well, I shouldn't say all. I mean, I'm not active on Twitter. I don't know how to use sorry, I don't know how to use TikTok. I know how to use Twitter. See, that's I can be found on Twitter quite frequently. Tweet there, so it's ATG_ABHISHEK. I also have my website where people can find all the work that I do. That's ABHISHEK .github.io. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn. If you type in my name along with the words AI ethics, I presume you should be able to find me. And if you don't, actually do shoot me a message and let's see what happens. Uh, and a good old Google search with my first and last name with the words AI ethics tends to turn up information about me. Last thing I'd like to say there is next week we have the State of AI Ethics report coming out. It's the second iteration of our report from the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, where we capture all of the research and development that's happened in this space over the past quarter, sort of summarized and made accessible in an easy to consume fashion. So if you haven't, subscribed to our newsletter from the Institute, please do so. It is at aiethics.substack.com.
Excellent. Great. We'll be on the lookout for that report. You said next week that'll be coming out?
Yep,
All
yep,
right.
coming out on
Excellent.
Tuesday next week. Yep.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for joining us here on the Tech Humanist Show, Abhishek. It's been wonderful to hear your perspective on AI ethics and the worldview of it, and your hopeful view on how machine translation can actually connect human knowledge in a richer way than ever before. So thank you so much for that.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Kate, for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, take care and get to sleep now. All right.
Thank you. Will
Thank
do.
you.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye,
Hey, talk to
everybody.
you soon. Bye.